Great. Thank you very much, Chair. It's a pleasure to be here, see some old friends and some new faces. I thought I'd sort of focus a bit on some of the specifics, and I imagine that Lucio is going to talk a fair bit about Philippines. I thought I'd just talk a little bit about Vietnam and how things are going in the South China Sea at the moment. Um, so there's obviously been a major transition in the Vietnamese Communist Party leadership over the past year or so. And it's interesting to think about how that might affect what Vietnam does in the region. Um, I think primarily the most important thing to think about here is that, for Vietnam, the most important factor is what is good for the Communist Party. And that always has to be the frame of reference, I think, that we use when we look at Vietnam's relations with both China, the US, and also with its other partners in the region and outside. Um, so when you look at where the clashes, the sources of tension are in the South China Sea, the important thing I think to recognize is that they are all at the extremity of China's U-shaped line. They are the areas where that U-shaped line overlaps with exclusive economic zones claimed from the Southeast Asian countries, whether that be off the coast of Vietnam or off Indonesia, Malaysia, or indeed the Philippines, which I'm sure we'll hear more about from Lucio shortly. And this, of course, is a legacy of this nine-dash line, U-shaped line, which has appeared on Chinese maps since 1948. And this line continues to play to act in Chinese thinking as some kind of boundary, even though there is no known legal basis, no justification for it officially from China. And you can see where China has engaged in seismic surveys against Southeast Asian countries, and you can see how the Coast Guard, the China Coast Guard, and its survey vessels use this line as an actual boundary. It's quite clear. As we know, the Philippines took China to an international arbitral tribunal to rule, and the tribunal ruled in 2016 that this kind of behavior was unlawful. But of course, that hasn't stopped anything. So looking at Vietnam's overall strategic position, as this map shows, on paper at least, Vietnam has a very strong position, occupies more than half of the features in the Spratly Islands, and as we know, has been building up the capabilities of its bases quite significantly in recent weeks. We've seen signs of new airfield, perhaps being built on Bark Canada Reef down here, in addition to the existing runway here on Spratly Island, and other signs of upgrades as well. And what's interesting here, I think, to me, is that whereas China has been punishing the Philippines for its activities on the the second Thomas Shoal, over here in this area of the sea. We've had clashes between Chinese and Philippine coast guards, very dramatic ones threatening to escalate. Vietnam has been able to upgrade its bases here without, it seems, any comeback from China at all. And it does seem to me that it's often been the case that China treats different ASEAN claimants in different ways at different times. But I do wonder whether this has been a sort of legacy of some kind of understanding that was reached between the Chinese and Vietnamese Communist parties. Vietnam has in effect abandoned almost all of its oil and gas exploration inside the U-shaped line. And so I go back, whereas the Philippines hasn't. And I think, well, there are two factors, I think, in the Philippines. One is this idea that the Philippines wants to develop oil and gas reserves inside China's claimed line over here. Plus, also, there's the element of the Taiwan and the US-China mutual defense treaty affecting those calculations, whereas it seems to be treating Vietnam differently. So Vietnam, is facing an economic, choke point, I suppose you might say, rapidly rising economic growth. Things are looking good, but it's having an energy shortage. And one of the reasons it's got this energy shortage is that China has successfully stopped Vietnam from developing offshore oil and gas reserves. So 2 years ago, Indonesia and Vietnam agreed their maritime boundary here, which unlocked. This is the area of the Indonesian exclusive economic zone, which overlaps with the Chinese claim line, U-shaped line here. And Vietnam and Indonesia had long been in dispute about where this boundary was here. That was finally settled 2 years ago. That then unlocked the idea that the tuna block, a gas field, could be developed, and the gas would then be piped to Vietnam, and that would help to unblock some of Vietnam's electricity problems. And this has angered China. China immediately sent its largest Coast Guard ship, the world's largest Coast Guard ship, down there to patrol the area and to intimidate Vietnam. But insofar, Indonesia and Vietnam seem to be holding firm on this. And I think this is, a sign of a crisis, a further crisis to come, perhaps. We look at what happened in a different area of the sea. This is Vietnam's southeastern coast here. Back in in 2018, 2017, Vietnam was forced to cancel gas drills down here, and then another one in 2020, because they were all on the wrong side of China's U-shaped line. So I think Vietnam is hoping that Indonesia will take the flak for developing a bit further south and west in the tuna block area here. But I think a sort of some kind of crunch is coming here. There are other places where Vietnam and China have potential flashpoints, I think, also around the edges of the U-shaped line. Vietnam and China have agreed their maritime boundary between up to this point at the mouth of the Tonkin Gulf. But the problem has always been how to extend this boundary line further. The logical halfway point would be to go in this direction, but because there is a dash of the 9-dash line here, China wants the line to come down here. So this rather small but very politically sensitive triangle of sea here is a problem, because there are, again, oil and gas fields in this area. I've enlarged them here. So this little area here is a potential flashpoint too. And then further down the south, you've got another extension of the U-shaped line. And again, we've got potential clashes down here. So all of these are potential places where Vietnam and China could clash. This is where China has drawn its own oil and gas blocks over the top of Vietnam's oil and gas blocks. The problem, of course, for Vietnam is how it continues to fuel its economic growth, and one of its responses has been to increase the construction of coal-fired power stations, which it's not supposed to be doing, given its commitments under for example, the joint energy, the Just Energy Transition Partnership with its G8 partners. But it seems that because of China's blocking of gas exploitation in the South China Sea, Vietnam is turning or relying more on coal for its energy transition. This is the Philippines, this is Batangas, and maybe Lucio will address some of this in his presentation. But it's interesting to think, I think, about how China's actions in the South China Sea are changing the energy dynamics of several countries. So the Philippines used to be able to rely on the Malampaya gas field for a fifth of its electricity generation, and that has declined rapidly. But rather than being able to develop its own indigenous resources in the South China Sea under the Reed Bank, Philippines has had to turn to importing LNG, liquefied natural gas, from places like Australia. So rather than having an energy resource under its own control, which generates revenue for the government and doesn't pose currency problems, for example, balance of trade problems, it's now reliant on imports on the international markets and all the rest of it. And Vietnam is going the same way. Rather than being able to exploit its own offshore gas resources, it's having to import from elsewhere, which has been good news for Japanese and other energy companies, but maybe bad news for the Vietnamese state budget and its own energy security. So these are having, I think, long-term consequences on the nature of strategic calculations in the South China Sea. So the new leadership, here's To Lum, the new General Secretary of the Communist Party on the left here. visiting Beijing in August. And the real question is, which way is Vietnam going to turn? Tolam is a man from the Public Security Ministry, a general. He is one of, I think, eight police and military army generals in the, when I say police, I mean public security.
Dr. Hayton,
Yeah.
could I
Yeah.
request you to just thank you?
Right. Okay. So this is the big question. We could leave it open. Which way is Vietnam going to flip when it comes, or is it going to? We hear a lot about bamboo diplomacy. Is it really bamboo, or is it really going to be a lean towards China? We can maybe talk about that later.